This podcast is brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International. To find out more, visit blackaby.org.
Well, welcome to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast. My name is Sam, and I'm your host, and joining me, as is his custom, Dr. Richard Blackaby.
Yes, good to be with you once again, Sam, after all these years.
After all these years, it's we're still going strong, and it's been an absolute pleasure to do this, and something I was noticing the other day, and perhaps it's a morbid thought, but everybody dies. You know, like that's a reality that we face.
Why are you looking at me when you say that?
Well, I mean, you know, if nature takes its course, you'll probably be before me. But it's something that, you know, just I do a lot of looking at culture sometimes, and it's something that we really don't like to think about.
No.
We don't like to contemplate our own demise.
Yeah, and I think we, especially in the West and in America, we live in perpetual denial. You know, we know intellectually that none of us will live forever, but at the same time, rarely do we prepare for it properly. And so the reason that I think I wanted to maybe talk about this today was really, some of you, if you follow me on social media, you probably know that my parents have both really declined significantly in the last 5 to 6 weeks. And and that just is really, I don't want to be morbid about it, but it has certainly caused me to do some serious thinking about that. And so I just thought maybe today be a little bit different, but just reflecting on life and some lessons learned. And, you know, one of the things I think that leaders that are wise do is they learn from other people's experience. I don't want to be at death's door and then trying to figure out how to finish well. I want to watch those going before me and see things that I want to emulate in my life, and maybe some things I want to do better, but reflecting on life. And I think that's important. And, you know, it was said years and years ago that think about what you wanted to be said on your tombstone, or what you wanted to be said about your funeral, and then back up and make sure you live in such a way that that's what they do say about you. Mm-hmm. And so I think sometimes living with the end in view is helpful in saying we all know what our end will be. So how should we be living toward that? And
yeah, I know it was a big deal among the Stoics that they always sort of point to that, like we're all mortal here.
Yeah, so we're mortal, and in some ways, you know, that can make you kind of discouraged or depressed to think, well, what's the point? You know, I'm going to die anyway. On the other hand, it also can motivate you to make the best use of the time you have. Our time is not limitless, and so we need to use it well and wisely. And so those perhaps that have been following my parents' journey, you know, about 6 weeks or so ago, my wife and I were getting ready to go up to Canada for about 2 weeks, and so we had the family over to our house the night before, and my mom drove my dad over for dinner at our house and had a nice visit. And you know, my mom had a kind of a tough week that week with just some aging kind of issues, and but she was doing fine. She still drove over and came in and enjoyed seeing her grandkids and great grandkids, and went home. And then my wife and I left for 2 weeks to go to Canada. But when we came back, it just seemed as if everything had changed. My mom was not doing well, was in the hospital, and my dad had 3 different ambulance rides to 3 different hospitals in the course of 2 weeks or so. And you just watched, especially my mother. My mother has always just been a very, very strong person. She's put up with a lot from my dad traveling the world, and she's an extrovert. She hates to miss out on anything. And so no matter how tired she is, if there's a party going on, she's going to be there, you know. Yeah. And she's been very supportive of her kids and grandkids. I mean, she could be at times growing up, she could drive us crazy sometimes because she was a little too involved in our life sometimes. But you know, if you had a need, you might be living in Norway at the time, or you might be somewhere else, thousands of miles away. But if she needed to, she'd jump on a plane and be there. If you needed financial help, even though they never had just a lot of money. You knew a check would be coming, what they could give, like whatever you needed. And so they've just always been larger than life people to me. And of course, then my dad he is just a spiritual giant. He's written a Christian classic. He has spoken to world leaders, to presidents of the United States. He has spoken in front of stadiums of tens of thousands of pastors and other people, and has just written and thought and seen so much in the Christian life that has deeply impacted my life. And so to see them frail and weak, and really at this point neither one of them wants to get out of their chair. My mom at this point can't get out of a chair, and both of them ended up getting COVID for the first time just a couple weeks ago. Because my mom had to go to the hospital, she got COVID and brought it back to my dad unknowingly. And then the worst news was that my mother had this ongoing fever, and they couldn't figure out, having come out of a urinary tract infection and coming out of COVID, they thought they had all that under control, but they couldn't figure out why she still had this fever. And after a number of tests and hospital days trying to figure it out, finally discovered that she had some tumors in her liver, and they're inoperable. Chemotherapy won't really work for her, and so they gave her 3 to 6 months to live. And even then, she's facing that, and then really in just the past week, she's declined to the point where she can't. She's almost just entirely invalided at this point. Can't hardly talk. I was going to feed her lunch yesterday or dinner, and I had to just physically lift her up and put her in a wheelchair. She can't even take a step. Can't lift her feet when you're pushing her on the wheelchair. And I had to just spoon feed her every bite. And I'm in my 60s now. I feel fortunate that I still have both my parents, but it's become obvious that their days physically are not long left ahead of them. And so as I watch that, I realize, these are my parents, and I realize that I'm following behind them, that a day will come when I will be weak. Sam, I don't know that, I'll have to ask you to spoon feed me my dinner, but there may come a day when
Hopefully
I need you to.
There'll be some technology where I don't have to,
so,
that.
Just a couple of thoughts. And one is that we all will face physical decline at some point. It's just rare for us. If you live long enough, you're just going to lose your strength. And I've already lost a lot of my strength. Now whenever we're around something heavy, like you're a good son-in-law and stepping in to do it for me. And I'm 6'2", 200 plus pounds. I've not had that many people feeling they needed to help me to lift things or carry things in the past. And so it kind of says something to you when the younger guys are looking out for the old guy and say, "Hey, Richard, let me get that for you." And it's just kind of a reminder, I still have some strength. I'm, not a foot in the grave yet, but already the trends are there. And, I'm past my physical peak at least. And so what that tells me, there's a couple things, I guess. And this could be a very morbid, depressing talk, but I think what it says to me, a couple things. And one is, that time is precious. And if you had known my parents in their prime, they were a whirlwind. They were on the go all the time. They couldn't even get their suitcase completely unpacked until they had to be packing it back up and heading to the airport again. And all kinds of amazing trips and talks and book opportunities to write, and so many, just the opportunities swirled about my parents. And of course they accomplished a great deal. And really, if you knew them at that time, you would have thought, the thought of them in the condition they're in now wouldn't have crossed your mind. You couldn't have pictured it as, unable to feed themselves.
Yeah.
But what you realize is we really only have a limited amount of time as adults. If you count the time you're growing up and learning how to be an adult, and then the time when you now no longer have the strength, energy, or whatever to continue serving the Lord, then you just have a window of maybe a couple of decades of peak performance capability.
Yeah.
And so what that says to me is, number one, use the time wisely. Number two, don't live your life as if you've got lots of time to do stuff. If there's something that you know God wants you to do, it's better to get it done. I can't tell you how many people have told me, I've always thought I'd like to write a book, or I'd always like to do this or do that, and haven't gotten around to it yet. And my observation at this point, my dad's not going to write any more books. My dad's not going to preach any more sermons.
Yeah.
If he didn't get it done by now, it's not going to happen. I may write something drawing upon his material and his thoughts, but he's not going to do it. And so that says to me, and so I've kind of taken, I've had a bunch, I've checked a bunch of boxes here lately. I've finished off 2 different study Bibles. I've just turned in a book manuscript about 2 weeks ago. I don't think that that's all that I'm going to do writing-wise. I've got a couple other projects. One I'm trying to finish up still, and another I'll be looking at maybe next year of doing. But I don't want to have a bunch of stuff pushing the can farther down the road. If I'm going to do it, I want to try to keep my accounts up to date, so that because of course we're all one stroke, one heart attack away from not being able to think clearly again. And Sam, you and I both know we're both grieving today, because just yesterday we heard of a tragic death, I think from a heart attack or heart failure of some kind. But I did this man's wedding in July, and now in September he's dead.
Yeah.
His bride discovered that he was dead in their bed, and married about 2 months or so.
Yeah.
And such a nice guy, and not certainly not old, where you'd be thinking that might be a possibility. And so it just has created a certain sense of urgency for me, that you have to ask yourself, if I suddenly contracted a serious illness and declined rapidly and was unable to ever write a book again, or travel again, or do certain things I always had thought about doing, would I face my final days kicking myself for not having gotten on that faster? And so that's certainly one. And a second one, and we talked a bit about this the other day, but my parents are at this point, literally, I spent yesterday afternoon with them, and they just sat in their chairs. They for the most part, right now at least, they sit in their recliner chairs in their living room, and they sit there all day. And if you can get them to get up and help them get to the kitchen table, they'll eat a meal, and then they'll go back and sit in their chairs. Now, they've had nice houses in the past. They've had, not mansions, but they've had full-size houses and basements and upstairs, and that would be completely wasted on them now. Mm-hmm. All they need really is a comfortable chair and a comfortable bed. And I don't say this harshly. It's just that when you get to a certain age when you're so tired and frail that you don't. You could have 10 guest rooms. You could have a nice, beautiful swimming pool in your backyard. You could have a nice walking path through the gardens in the back of your property. It won't matter. You can have all kinds of stuff in the back 40. My dad would have no interest right now in going to see any of that. He just tell me where my chair is. And that's not to be critical. That's just when you have no energy, when you have no strength, when it's painful to walk. That's all you need. And so, we've kind of talked about this before, but over the last several years, we've been significantly downsizing with my parents, and they've been given away. They've always been very generous, and they haven't been materialistic by any means. But they've nice furniture that they had. If someone wants it, if a grandchild wants it, just take it. Just my mom, especially, has just said, "Hey, do you like this? Would you want it? Just take it home with you. I'd rather you have it right now than it take up space." And And so they've increasingly lived in smaller and smaller places and needed less and less things. And for a lot of us, our last day may just be a hospital room with a sparsely furnished room with a hospital bed.
Yeah.
And even kings, kings of England that ruled the British Empire and could shout off with their heads, and people could live in terror of them, who could build all kinds of palaces and live in all kinds of houses. And yet, at the end of the day, they're basically consigned to a bedroom in one of their palaces, and that's all they need anymore is that bed, and no matter how wealthy you are. And so, again, that just says to me, there's nothing wrong with having a nice house, a big house, or some nice things. But just know that if that is your life, if your life is about accumulating more property and more possessions, if you live long enough, you won't care about a lot of that stuff at a certain time. But the flip side is, if you invest in people, then even when you can't get up and move anymore, those people you invested in they may come to you, And so in the last 6 weeks or so, I've got two brothers who live outside the state, one in Canada, and they've all made their way down, and their kids, my parents' grandkids, they've all been making their way down to just see them, perhaps for the last time, at least my mom anyway. And that you realize that's the future. They did invest in people and in grandkids and young people. And so, for instance, my oldest son, Mike, is pastoring in Canada now. Well, my dad's not ever going to pastor again. But my dad did pastor in Canada in the past, and his story has inspired people, and it inspired my son. And now my son is doing what his grandfather did years before.
Yeah.
And so even though my dad can't do it anymore, his descendants are carrying on and continuing that work. And Dad can't really run Blackaby Ministries International anymore, but I can. And so we're flourishing as much as we ever have. And so he doesn't have to run it anymore, but he raised up kids and grandkids that can, and so that's fine. And, I just think sometimes we neglect people because we're so concerned about things or money or our work. And then one day, money, things, work don't really matter anymore. And what does matter, we've neglected. And I guess I thought about that. We have nurses and people that we have that we brought in to care for our parents, and just the day-to-day, a lot of the kind of nursing, personal care that they need. And a number of them, I was talking to a couple yesterday, and they were just marveling at our family and just the way we just keep coming around to help. And last Sunday, I had to teach a Bible study at our church, and then I booted it out with my daughter, Carrie, your wife, and we went over there to spend a bit of time Sunday morning with them since they can't get out. And, my mother was kind of complaining about sore feet on that day. And my mom used to be famous she was really into this thing about rubbing your feet with this special foot lotion. And it was always a little hard for me as a guy to have my mom, just because she's my mom, like, just not that I mind having a foot massage, but it always kind of seemed like, what am I doing? Why is my mom doing that for me? But that was her way, one of her ways to love us and show that love. And so she would insist that, with all the time I stood on my feet preaching and teaching, that, this would be really good for me. And so she would insist, on ministering to her son that way. And so when she complained about her feet on Sunday, I just said, well, Mom, let me get that lotion. Like I said, you know what? I will rub your feet. You've done that for me lots of times. I don't know that I've ever rubbed stuff on my mom's feet before. And I said, I'm well past due to return the favor. And so as I'm starting to do that, my daughter, Carrie, jumps in and says, no, Dad, let me do that. And, most people don't argue about who gets to rub someone's feet. But, as you know, Sam, as well as I do, that, Carrie loves her grandma, and it was like, hey, here's a tangible thing I can do to let her know how much I love her. And, it just struck me that as my mother is in frail condition, her son and her granddaughter both would be happy to rub her feet and care for her in a very menial sort of way. And then I'm thinking about, I wondered, well, what about the people that alienated themselves from all their kids and don't know their grandkids, and now they're aging and they're sitting alone with aching feet and nobody checking in on them to see if they're okay, and no one wanting to rub their feet or even just stop by to say hi. Your wife and you both raise flowers as kind of a side gig to sell flowers and arrangements and from your property. And Carrie's been great just to, each week make sure my mom's got some fresh cut flowers in her place. And I'm looking at that and saying, now here lies a if you just didn't know anything about my mom and you just saw this frail older woman, you might just you wouldn't have any idea. Like, so what was this person like? Now she seems very frail and weak, and yet then you start watching these grandkids of hers, eager, happy to rub her feet, to bring her flowers, and you just think, so how did this person live? How did they live? And you and I both know my mother is far from perfect. There's lots of things that could drive me crazy, but there was also a sense in which she expressed her love very tangibly, and whatever she knew to do, she would do. And there's an interesting passage. Maybe I can just mention, but in 2 Samuel, there's an interesting passage, 2 Samuel 21, verses 15 to 22, and it just says that King David was going out to war just like he did every year. Only this time, when he went to fight against some of the Philistines, it says that he grew weak, grew frail, and an enemy that was actually a descendant of Goliath came after him to kill him. And Abishai, we've talked about him before, that kind of loyal right-hand man that just seems to always step in to help David. He comes to the rescue and kills this giant before he can kill David. And so the Israelites win the day. But after that, it says that his men all sternly told David, you are not going to battle again. You've just fought your last battle. Now you're frail enough, weak enough. You used to be a fearless leader in battle. You could take on giants. We all followed your lead. But that day is over. And as it is over in everyone, you may have been a giant killer that could take on a Goliath, but there's a day coming when you're more of a liability than a help to be on the battlefield. And so they said, but don't worry, because we're all here, and you've raised up a bunch of mighty men, and we will continue to fight the giants and fight the enemies of God, but you can't anymore. And David, to his credit, doesn't he tended to listen to his men when they talked to him like that. But then it goes on to say that it mentions the stories of about 4 different giants that I think were all related to Goliath, like his sons or brothers and people like that. And it tells how different Israelites killed those giants, and to the point that even one of David's nephews kills a giant. And so you realize he had his day. He killed his giants in his day. But a day came when his strength was waning, and it didn't necessarily mean he couldn't still be a blessing and do things. It just meant he couldn't carry a sword and go out in battle when everybody wanted to kill you. Yeah. And so I think for us as well, I realize there's a season when we can put on our armor and go out into battle, and we're carrying the weight. We're in the heat of the fray. But a time's going to come when we just don't have the strength to do that anymore. And the question will be, did we raise up any other giant killers while we were in our prime, while we were leading? Did we make it all about us? And as soon as we're not able anymore, does our organization fall apart? Or in that season, while we had our health and strength and vigor, were we investing in raising up others who could carry on after our strength began to decline? And so there are some people, sadly, that are very lonely, bitter, forsaken, elderly people that they never invested in people, and now that they're in decline, nobody is investing very much in them. And so I watched my parents, and the flood of cards and people just asking, how can we help? And your mother came this week, in fact, Sam, and just said, let me just give an afternoon to ministering to this fine couple, and she was a blessing. And so again, this is kind of more of a sobering podcast, and I'm sure we'll have some updates on their health in the weeks to come. But it's been a bit of a wake-up call to me to say, and one day that will be me. Mm-hmm. And so am I investing people today so that when I can't invest anymore in them, will they appreciate enough what I've done that they will want to minister to me? Because they know when I had the opportunity, I ministered to them, and I tried to bless them. And we all have our season to impart a blessing, and then there comes a time we need to receive it. And so I don't know the ages of all of our listeners listening to this podcast, but we will all get to the end of ourselves one day. And I pray that when you do, you will have lived wisely enough and been a blessing to enough people that you'll be surrounded by those that will walk with you in your declining days as well. And you can celebrate a life well lived that was blessed and appreciated by many others.
Yeah, well, I think that's a great place to leave it. And thank you for that sobering reminder today.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, it really makes a difference if you leave a review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. We always love hearing from our listeners, so email us at podcast@blackaby.org.